it decreases a little at first, but when you like think of the
Hello, guys.
Hi, Irfan.
Hi, Quinton.
Yeah, I think Paul is out of the office this week, so maybe we can get started. I think we've got most of the other people here.
Okay. Okay. So last week, where were we? Yeah, I did not get time to, think about what ideally we should be discussing today. So I don't have a set agenda or a specific point for today's discussion. In last work group sync, I guess we had some amount of discussion on what we want to present or be talking about at KubeCon, which I think is getting resolved as part of the slide deck Christian presented or Christian has initiated. So apart from that, is there anything else that we have on mind to talk about? Maru, you have something that you would want to talk about?
I don't think so. I mean, I think probably it might make sense at some point to be discussing the planning that we touched on yesterday, like 6 months, year, or whatever. I'm not sure that this is the right place to do it if there's no preamble. We haven't like done our homework, but I guess I'm open to that if people are interested.
Yeah, I apologize. I should actually have put some points against it, and
No, it's not on you. Like I said,
so actually we could have done that. I mean, taken that exercise and utilized this time. I have one point though, which actually, as part of the PR, the discussion has happened. But I see that because Shashi also faced a similar issue, that is about grouping of different APIs in V2, the current place. So I somehow feel that it might be a good time that maybe we move the grouping as like we discussed, initiate the project or reinitiate the project with federation.kts.io as the domain, and have better naming of the groups that we are defining. Like I initiated a group and I named it Federated Scheduling, and Shashi now is initiating a status, and he probably will have to name it something like Federated Status or something like that, not to interfere with other statuses that already are there. Does that sound logical? Or
I mean, if we were to continue to define API types via generation, then it probably makes sense to reset it, as you say. I'm kind of leaning towards just thinking of a CRD future, in which case the group names are a little bit less important. I mean, you still need them, but you don't have this dependency on the project having a certain base domain. I think you could be a lot more flexible.
Okay.
But it's, what do people think about the idea of kind of targeting near-term switch to CRD?
I somehow feel that because one of those problems around versioning, I think that still remains, right? CRDs cannot independently have different versions and all. So
It's true, but I mean, that's been something that we've mentioned in the past as kind of a blocker for adoption of CRD. Having sort of been dug a little bit deeper, I'm a little less concerned. Reason being, like supporting multiple versions is kind of a nightmare anyway. So really, you're only going to support one version at a time. And you can kind of provide backwards compatibility. I don't know. I mean, Kubernetes, I think, has kind of a harder problem to solve because they're dependent on by so many different people. So backwards compatibility requirements are a little bit, like they need to be stricter for them. If we were to ensure backwards compatibility by adopting the same sort of field level, like if you add a new field, it's optional. That's just kind of the way you ensure backwards compatibility, and you ensure that the default is sane so that people who don't provide it won't get unexpected behavior. My understanding of CRDs is you don't have the possibility of having like V1 alpha 1, V1 beta 1, V1. But I guess for me, like if we need that backwards compatibility, we can always get it in the future. If we were to avoid defining APIs via the standard like API machinery code generation way, and just do CRDs, that means we could potentially avoid having to impose the like operational requirement of an API server. We don't have aggregation, we don't have a separate etcd instance or maybe just shared etcd instance. And if in the future we, like before we go GA, we realize, oh, we actually do want the capabilities provided by our own API server, we can always switch, right? Like to my mind, like GA is kind of would be the decision point. Like at that point, would be like, do we understand this well enough? Has CRD, like for all we know, CRD could have versioning support in the next 6 months to a year. In which case, like, so to me, it's kind of like there's a certain amount of risk of just going the CRD path because we might have to switch. But if we don't have to switch, that's awesome. And if we do have to switch, I don't think it's a high cost. Like if you
That sounds like a very reasonable approach to me. I agree. I think we should just worry about the more difficult stuff now, and we're going to go alpha, then beta, then GA, right, for each of these things. And so we have some choices we can make later down the road. Ideally, we would like to make them like before beta, because in a perfect world, you don't want there to be much of a difference between beta and GA. But alpha, if things move around, as long as the actual API constructs are, reasonably well thought out in alpha, if they move to a different group or to CRDs versus not, that's not something that is a big problem to change going from alpha to beta. What I thought might be a good approach, so we ideally want to publish a 12-month tentative roadmap like this week. It was supposed to be published last week, but we kind of missed it. Is it worth talking about the level of detail I was thinking might be useful would be to identify the primary API types that we're interested in implementing in the next 12 months to the best of our understanding of what that looks like today, and figure out who's interested in implementing specific types in the next 12 months, and rough guidelines. We expect federated deployments to be alpha in June and beta in October, and something along those lines. Is now perhaps a good time to have that discussion, or
no time like the present?
Yeah.
I think maybe reframing would be helpful for me anyway. The old strategy of saying like, oh, we're going alpha or going beta with deployments, for example. Like to me, like I've been more focused on building infrastructure, like say for propagating everything. And so like initially, we'll be able to propagate all these resources. And especially when we move to CRDs, this means that the fact that we don't support something out of the box is not necessarily a blocker for adoption. Because supporting, like when we talk about like moving to CRD, that means like template placement, override substitution, whatever. They can be defined by CRDs. And as long as sort of the convention is maintained, you'll be able to propagate them. More advanced behavior like scheduling, I'm assuming that's what you mean by deployments, is scheduled deployments.
Yeah.
That's more like, you know, I want support for all these things to propagate them, but then I want dynamic scheduling. And so to me, it's like, do I support deployments or not isn't really the question. It's, do I support propagation of deployments? Level 1. Do I support like scheduling across clusters of deployments? That's like level 2.
Sure, and whatever those macro pieces of functionality are, and you're right. I mean, deployment might not be the right granularity. There might be simple deployments and scheduled deployments, or whatever we call those.
Yeah, whatever we call
them. I still think we need to say, well, we plan to do simple ones in alpha by day
Yeah,
X,
I agree.
and,
I wasn't trying to disagree with that. I was just
yeah. And maybe they actually come out at the same time. Maybe different groups are working on the simple one and the complex one, but I think they can still publish dates which may even coincide. And yeah, there's still this. I assume we still have this kind of high-level concept of the two primary use cases. The one being cluster admin, so propagating, you know, quotas and whatever other sort of things that cluster admins care about to multiple clusters. And then we have the application management use case where people deploying, you know, typically deployments and services and load balancers and such things, propagate those across multiple clusters.
I think that makes sense. Yeah, I guess.
So do we want to?
Sorry.
Yeah. No, carry on.
I tagged everybody who's been working on V2, Huawei, and Red Hat in Christian's slide deck, because there was a point where he was like, you know, what's next? And I put down some of the like near-term things I figured we want to be doing on the Red Hat side in the next 6 months.
Okay, great.
I wanted to make sure that Huawei got a chance to do so as well, because I think ideally one of the outcomes isn't just providing this to PM, but also providing material for Christian to present at KubeCon.
Yeah, absolutely. And for to guide ourselves, you know, at least we've collectively agreed that this is what we're planning to do, and then we can measure ourselves against that every quarter or whatever and say, oh, we're on track, or we're changing our minds, or whatever the case may be. I'm just looking for Christian's slide deck, and maybe I can.
I have it if you'd like.
Have a look. All right, no, I've got it here. Yeah, you can, welcome to present it if that's easy for you to do.
I pasted the link in the chat.
Okay.
Maru, did you put a comment, or where did you put that exactly?
Yeah, I put a comment on slide 7.
Slide 7. Okay, got it.
So yeah, I mean, a lot of the stuff that I put down was just like baseline, like being able to do simple propagation of any type, including CRDs. And so it doesn't cover like the scheduling stuff that I'm assuming you guys are going to want. I guess something that I didn't put down, which is it's more in the scheduling side of it, but in terms of scheduling, saying this, I'm worried that we'll just go off into the weeds, but the idea of being able to group resources together in like an application, it kind of has to be scheduled. Like things have to be scheduled together. I guess what was the terminology used? Constraints.
I don't recall. Yeah, that sounds reasonable, like placement constraints or something. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I was kind of realizing when I think it was kind of a gap in my knowledge or experience. Scheduling of like deployments or replica sets always happened in isolation, which in a realistic scenario, like maybe that works for jobs or other things that are, you know, they're kind of batch oriented and don't necessarily have dependencies. But it seems to me that like scheduling of deployments and replica sets in isolation, I'm not sure how useful that is. And I guess I'm curious because was that the intent to sort of do group scheduling at some point, or was that just, seems complicated. So I can see why maybe it would be something you wouldn't want to do. But.
Maybe everyone wants to speak about that. I think he has some ideas about it. I'm happy to talk about it, but
yeah, when you Maru, when you mention about group scheduling, you are talking about multiple deployments or multiple replica sets together, or you are talking about different types altogether together?
Could be different types. I mean, for example, I have a deployment that depends on a secret and a config map, and I have to make sure that when I'm scheduling that deployment into cluster A, that I also make sure to move or also replicate its dependencies, secret config map, whatever it might be.
So implementation-wise, there are two ideas that I have, which are like which I think if implemented as two different API types would make sense. So one is scheduling type, which is very synonymous with whatever placement, no, not they were called replica placement preferences or replica allocation preference, something like that in V1. The annotations we used to use on replica sets and deployments, which will define the weight or the min-max of each for each cluster. So that I would be targeting that kind of preferences can be applied on a deployment or a replica set, and in future probably can have in place of a target ref can have a label selector kind of a thing, so that they can be applied on multiple deployments together or multiple replica sets together. The second portion is which I think is a different problem or a parallel problem which need not be solved in the same type, is placement of multiple resources or applying constraints on different types together. Something like a policy enforcer or an admin which want to do that. So which I think I would target implementing in a different API type and a different controller, which can place either using a label selector or something like that, place multiple resources of different types also at desired locations, so either in one cluster or not in one cluster, that kind of stuff. Does that make sense?
It does. Just to try to like get back to the goal here is to get like a plan for 6 months, a year, or whatever. I guess in my mind, I was sort of questioning the utility of being able to just to schedule replica sets or deployments in isolation, and then talking about, okay, well, you could schedule groups of things, and then maybe they're related resources. It seems like a hard problem, and I guess I have a hard time conceptualizing how to actually validate it, because I find you can schedule things, like you can decide where you want things, but then if there's quota or resource constraints that prevent, then you have to go back and try, like, anyway, I'll stop.
Yeah, so yeah, when quotas and resource constraints.
Sorry, go
sorry, go ahead. Sorry. Okay, so when quotas and resource constraints, etc., also come in picture, then the problem is like, if you call it a problem, then it is magnified, or if you call it a level of abstraction, we go probably one more level of abstraction above, saying that now you have to implement the scheduling paradigm together with multiple other constraints in place. For example, you have to think about a quota also, and then you have to think about some other constraints possibly which are implemented by, I don't know, maybe an admin or some other resource. So maybe one step at a time.
Right? Yeah. Sorry, I'm rat-holing again. Anyway, I guess my thought was just that it seems like a really hard problem, like an order of magnitude harder than any of the stuff that's been done so far. So I guess I'm curious as to where you think that lies in terms of timeline. But I shouldn't.
So exactly to.
I'd be curious to see where you think these different stages lie on a schedule. or a plan?
Yeah, so first milestone that I'm targeting is being
And are we
able
gonna
to
write this
reflect.
down? Sorry.
Yeah, I was actually taking notes before I
Okay,
started
you're doing
speaking.
that. Okay, good.
Yeah. So the first milestone that I'm targeting is to have mirrored exactly the same functionality that V1 had probably, which is a very short-term milestone. I should be able to do or finish it uh, as maybe in weeks time or couple of weeks time if I don't face any problems and like that. But the second one that I mentioned, which lies in the domain of probably policy or probably placing multiple resources of different types together or applying constraints, that kind of stuff. There, a lot of thought will need to go in defining the API itself. That might be month or so. After I finished it, it's like that. And then if we are talking about the third problem you were saying, where resources and quotas and all those things, I can't really estimate that as of now. It'll be tough to estimate that.
Just one comment which may be useful is I would imagine one could break the. I agree with Maru that it is a difficult problem in its entirety, but I think we can perhaps break it down into pieces that are much easier to think about. The one piece is how does an application administrator specify that they want a group of things to be in the same clusters. So the example you gave, I want my deployment to go into some subset of clusters, and I want these secrets and these config maps, or this secret and this config map to go into the same clusters. So I think just specifying that is one problem, and I think that's fairly tractable. And then the question is, how do we actually enforce that? How do we schedule that stuff in such a way that they all do successfully go into a set of clusters that adhere to the set of constraints that the application admin might have specified? And I think to make that work 100% in all cases guaranteed is impossible, because you can never know that there will be, a set of clusters which fulfill the constraints that the application administrator specified and which all have the right amount of quota of the right types in all the right places. But I think in the common case, some of those types will probably be more difficult to schedule than others. So for example, it would be more difficult to get a replica set to deploy correctly into a given cluster than perhaps to add a secret or a config map to that cluster. And so that might be a way of tackling it, to say, well, the first iteration of the scheduler picks the difficult resources, puts them in, gets them to work successfully in clusters, and then make sure that the dependent resources follow those. Did that make sense?
I think that makes sense. I mean, I think that the existing sort of scheduling primitives that we've talked about and exist in Federation V1, that solves the problem of like, where do I want my complicated or resource requiring resources? And then on the other hand, like the SIG-APP's definition of like an application where you relate resources, that could be like how you actually get the second, like you define dependencies that ensure scheduling of those other things.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Okay.
Unfortunately, with the new like decoupled way of doing these things, so the user preferences for where they want their replica set, for example, are decoupled from the output that a scheduler or a human might make to say, put this thing in this cluster, in this cluster, in this cluster, make that problem arguably more easy to think about. Because as a first pass, we might actually only support the second half of that process, and then decide how to step back one level and say, right, how do I specify looser constraints that allow a scheduler to generate those things?
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, I mean, those at least seem like separable problems.
Mm-hmm.
And as you say, breaking it down makes it tractable versus trying to think of it all, which just hurts my brain.
Okay, so just having a look at your slide number 6, I guess it is. Is that the one that you put all your stuff in? So over and above the basic plumbing and the cluster registry, you're focusing on secrets, looks like.
Sorry, slide 6 is actually Christian's kind of outline of where we're at. Slide 7 was the like everything else, like 6 months, and so I commented. It's not content. It's just.
Oh, I see. Okay,
and
let me.
Irfan's actually replicated.
I have replicated the same into the meeting notes.
CRDs, overrides of arbitrary fields, deployment of the API as CRD, integration with external DNS. Like a lot of this stuff is just basically backfilling to get us to a V1 compatible or equivalent state. And then I think the stuff that you guys are working on is going to be like extending that beyond.
Okay, so on your list, there are no actual types or features from a user's perspective.
I think there is going to be features in terms of DNS and ingress, kind of replicating federated services and federated ingress.
Okay. Is that something Red Hat's interested in doing?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
And I'm not specifying explicit types because the goal is getting the barrier to implementing a new type as low as possible so that it's not really a work item. It's just kind of a, you need that? Here, take half an hour and it's done.
Oh, okay, that's great. Yeah, and I guess if services and load balancers or ingress are important, then they need to have pods underneath them somehow. So I guess deployment would be the natural thing to go along with those. So are we collectively, do we have any sort of rough, is this stuff that you expect to have out by the middle of the year?
Yeah, well, I should say that like all the propagation and the CRD stuff, like that's the near term. And maybe integration with external DNS, which I think Shashi has already sort of started on, like laying the groundwork for. In kubemci, it sounds like Google is off doing stuff and hasn't really been communicating about it. Or we haven't heard about it, but my guess is that whatever they're doing, moving kubemci from a CLI tool to something that's controller-based, Federation will be able to have some way of integrating that. So it's not like we want to do most of the work. It's more like there's something that can be used separately that we want to tie in. And similarly on external DNS, Paul has a proposal that he's been trying to, I don't know, he's kind of really tied up this week. But the goal is kind of doing external DNS, what was federated services in V1 a little bit differently, such that integration with like an Azure or GCP or AWS DNS solution will be controller-based and not necessarily have to live in tree. The idea being is there will be a controller in Federation proper, which will be watching services, both status and health, and writing resources like that indicate, the domain name and the IP addresses and that sort of thing that could be consumed by a controller that was programming external DNS. So the goal is sort of starting with a baseline of having DNS be out of tree so that it can be maintained by whoever wants to maintain it, rather than have to be really tightly integrated. And the other advantage of that approach is it wouldn't require that you use Federation. Anything that could create, like you could hand curate if you wanted to, those resources that the external DNS programmers would consume. So it offers the potential of people using that without Federation. So
yeah, that makes sense. I think that's a useful approach. I don't think we're that far away from it, actually. I mean, there's two parts to it. There's how do you, where do you express like the stuff that you want to be in the DNS? And currently that is done by the DNS provider API. So you just talk to the API and you say, I want these records in DNS, and it doesn't matter which flavor of DNS you're talking to, the API looks identical. And then there's the actual act of propagating that stuff, so those two are currently bundled together. You tell the API what stuff you want in an independent way, independently of which DNS provider you're using. And then that library actually propagates the stuff. So I guess the proposal is to pull those two apart. I can see the appeal in it. I guess.
I should say, I wish Paul had posted his sort of proposal, because then it would be a little bit clearer. I'm just sort of like giving a little bit of info to say that I think we have some ideas to start from at least, but by no means final.
Yeah, and hopefully that doesn't actually make too much difference to the code and the controllers and stuff, because right now they call an API and they say, I want these things in DNS, and it doesn't persist that into etcd anywhere, and there isn't a separate controller. It's all part of the same API. But it would be totally easy to write a DNS provider which does nothing other than consume that. It's a server for that API and stuffs the stuff in etcd, basically. And then have another piece of the controller that reads the stuff out of etcd and pushes it into the cloud providers, which is the current implementations of the DNS providers for, I think we've got 4 or 5 of them now.
But the goal would be is not having those be in tree and put the onus on like testing on the people who are maintaining it, rather than requiring it to be like a burden on Federation proper.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable.
So, yeah. And that also means that we're not gating. Like anybody who wants to do it can do it. They don't have to meet, our arbitrary standards for quality or code. We just have to implement it and ship it. So.
I think there already is a project on these lines which does similar job as what our entry DNS providers do. Shashi, you want to talk about it? He has been exploring that.
Yeah.
So
I kind of found like there is a project in Kubernetes incubator called external DNS. But that contains everything in a single repo, all the DNS providers, plus it also has the controllers which will monitor the load balancer services and ingresses and program this DNS. But I think, that needs to
clusters or with a single cluster.
Yeah, it's a single cluster.
Okay. So it might be that we could leverage that code and just to be able to apply it to multiple clusters.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure, because that also is supposed to be broken down into a DNS provider as a separate and a controller as a separate one. But right now it is all coupled, I believe. So I'm not quite sure how we can convince them to make it separate, and so that we can reuse that particular code. So
maybe the monitoring is something that we'd have to do, since we'd be doing cross-cluster, and then the programming would be something we could leverage from them.
Yeah.
But,
well, we've got all the programming already, I think. I mean, we have all the...
if they have it, maybe we could push responsibility.
Yeah. So one brief comment about this potential change of direction is the one benefit of what we have right now is that deployment is pretty straightforward. So you build... currently it's bound in, there's a DNS library, DNS controller library, I guess you would call it, that is part of the Federated Services Controller. And that in turn links in all the cloud providers, I believe. Sorry, DNS providers. And so when you deploy this thing, all you do is you deploy a generic service, it's a Federated Service Controller, and you just give it the config setting that says which DNS provider to use, and it does its thing. If we're going to decouple this stuff into separate controllers and have them in different repos and all that kind of stuff, we just need to make sure that someone wanting to deploy this thing like has a fairly easy path to saying, you know, I want to use DNS provider X, and you know, do it, and not have them have to jump through too many hoops to make that happen.
Agreed. I mean, my expectation would be that, like, if I had an external, like, I would configure my federation to write the resources that these things would consume. I would have a deployment for, like, both federation controllers and extra controllers, right? And or not a deployment, but I would have a series of, like, configuration, and it would basically just say run the controller for Azure, and here's the configuration so you can know what to expect.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I mean, that's the nice thing about Kubernetes is it really is trivial to compose things as long as there's images available, which I think that should be doable.
Yeah, and APIs that they agree to communicate via. Yeah, sounds good. One last parting comment on that. I guess one approach might be to just say we freeze what we have at the moment. We say we have, you know, 4 or 5, whatever it is, DNS providers, and they're linked into the V1 service, federated service controller. And if you want to use one of those, it's trivial. And there's also this extension point where you can use any of these external ones provided by whoever. They may or may not be stable. And if you want to implement more DNS providers, that's the way to do it. We've got 4 or 5 core ones, and outside of that, there's extension points to hook in whichever ones you want.
I guess I'm not really, like, fixed on any one approach. Like, we can kind of decide as we go.
Yeah.
I think my preference would be for having everybody on a level playing field. I think there's consequences to having some things baked in and on others not, because then there's less incentive to make the extension points really good because they're not shared by the stuff that everybody's using. But we can decide as we go, like I said.
Yeah. So do we want to write down some draft stuff here on perhaps slide 7 of user visible features with target quarters?
Yeah, so apart from what Maru you did specify, there are 2 things we can do. So I don't think we need to specify types as of now, but maybe we can list some core types that these we target federating as part of V2 by some timeline.
Yeah.
Maybe H1 or something like that, if that makes sense. Apart from that, I have noted down that we should be able to target DNS discovery and services like cross-cluster service discovery, some networking resources like ingresses and load balancers. I'm not sure load balancers is the right term to use, but I have anyways noted that down. And another point was integrate kubemci as an external or internal controller or entity into Federation.
Quentin, I'm not sure it's, like, valuable to just list all a bunch of types. Like, I think it makes sense to just say we're going to federate any kube type trivially. Sorry, we're going to propagate. And then we're going to provide scheduling for workload types like deployments and replica sets. Just because, like, the types, I think, obscure the underlying functionality. If people understand they can federate anything, and then we'll get special behavior for things that require it. To me, that makes more sense.
Fair enough. Maybe I'm misunderstanding some of the stuff. I mean, at the end of the day, we're going to release this thing at some quarterly boundary, presumably, and it's going to be able to federate some set of types in some defined way, you know, with or without scheduling, with, you know, whatever features we provide. And if your answer is the next release is going to have all of them, that's fine. Is that the plan, that you will be able to take any Kubernetes type and we will have, tests and system end-to-end tests to verify that these things all work correctly? Or are we going to carve off pieces and say, in June we're going to make sure that you can start using this subset of types, and then the next release you'll have all the other types?
I guess you do when I'm thinking about like what's required, like the goal is to be able to define like template placement override as CRDs and then register them such that they can be propagated. And this would take the place of like enabling a type in Federation V1. You would just register it, and you could, if you didn't register a type, it just wouldn't be propagated. There is a little bit of special behavior around services, and I'm not sure how far that extends to other things. I'm hoping that it's a rarity, but because of the way controllers interact on services, they modify the spec in a way that you can't just overwrite. Like his PR kind of made it clear that sometimes you actually have to look at the cluster resource, look at your desired object, and actually copy things into the desired object that have been set by a controller in that cluster. As long as there are minimal examples of that, like there's not a lot of work involved in supporting a new type. But as soon as we get into having to support that kind of behavior, it might be a bit more complicated.
Yeah, my experience, I implemented quite a few of the more complicated types, and I was involved in the design review of most of the others. I think the interesting types, and by interesting, I'm referring to deployments, services, ingress, jobs, what is the stateful sets, what else is there? I think that's the main interesting ones. Those all have logic in them that is somewhat specific to that type. Job completions and stuff, they actually mean something, and they're so I think.
But I should say there's two kind of levels here, because one is I have a stateful set, and I'm just going to copy it into each cluster. And the second is I have a stateful set, and I want to coordinate its propagation across clusters such that it somehow is cohesive.
Yeah, that's a fair point. So I think you're thinking primarily about the former case, and I guess maybe I'm thinking more about the latter case.
The point is, like, I want to implement something that's really simple for all the simple stuff, and then we can focus on the more complicated stuff.
Yeah.
Without worry about the underpinnings.
Yeah, no, that sounds reasonable. And we could potentially sort of do those in parallel if you're focused on the simple stuff, and we can be thinking about the more complicated stuff, assuming that the simple stuff is going to work at some reasonably well-defined point in time. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's already pretty close from a prototype perspective. I should say that we have a couple more work items before we're like exiting prototype phase, and then there's need to be some time invested in making the code like usable, I guess maintainable would be. Prototyping has been a lot of rapid development without a lot of unit testing, relying on integration in E2E. But I definitely like to shore it up and make sure that it's something that we can actually rely on longer term.
Yeah, and that's something that can be done sort of in parallel. I think it would be great if we could, certainly for alpha stuff. I mean, alpha is assumed to, not necessarily be production ready or stable yet, and shouldn't be used. And I think in the period between alpha and beta, we can allocate some time to beefing up unit test coverage and those kind of things. The other stuff, of course, not to forget is stuff like documentation. I mean, there's a huge value actually in these blogs and documentation, and making sure that someone who's all excited about this stuff can dive in and do a quick start, just follow the documentation and actually get something working and kick the tires. And that takes time. I mean, I wrote a lot of that stuff in the past, as many of you did, and it does take time.
Yeah, we have a starting point. We're almost at the point where someone will be able to deploy and use this for simple cases, but you're absolutely right that there's a lot more work than just code.
Okay, it feels like we're sort of wrapping up. One quick question I had on on slide number 6. I see there's a Maroon Federation V2. Is that, have we actually created a repo in the right place? Is that just a typo, or
Unfortunately, it's not a typo. We attempted to move it last week. I think you were out last week, and
no, I missed it, yeah.
There's some sort of process that we didn't realize, that if there is more than one contributor, you can't simply donate a repo. And there's some question, like it's basically in the hands of the steering committee, of which I believe you were a member.
I am indeed guilty.
So maybe you can investigate from that side. But we tried. We actually moved it over to Kubernetes SIGs, and then Brian Grant pushed back, and we had to move it back.
Okay, if you can just send me. I didn't see that discussion, but if you can just send me.
Yeah, there was a thread. I'll CC you.
I'll see if I can.
I'm not sure if it would have included.
Untangle it. It's probably in my inbox somewhere.
But I'm not sure you were included, actually.
Oh, okay.
It was kind of something that started in SIG multi-cluster, and then Brian took it off list to just me, Aaron, and Paul. So I'm going to forward you that thread so you can catch up.
Cool. I'll see if I can help there.
Okay, so yeah, I've sent it to you. But yeah, it sounds like we're just kind of lost in some sort of process, and for the time being, we're kind of stuck there. And I mean, I'm happy to just continue development, as long as it takes. But we are eager to see it move somewhere more official too.
Cool.
Hopefully by KubeCon, so we can change the slide.
Yeah, can you guys just have a look at the notes? I tried to list some of the items that while we were talking. Does that seem like a reasonable list of items that can be put as part of I don't know, a sheet or something as a
There's a couple duplications. I'm just gonna.
Yeah, please do that. Please update. I mean, quick update. And while Quinton was talking, I thought it might make sense. For example, there is a set of types which are simple types, and we sort of classify them. And we also classify that V2 or our whatever focus is or the work is might also propose that if we want to federate a particular type, like exactly you want to replicate the same object as is into multiple clusters, then there is a proposed mechanism, and these are the 3 steps or 4 steps you do, and you would be able to do that. Whereas there is some set of 3 or 4 different types which certainly need special handling, and I don't know if they all can be classified as types of scheduling, or they all can be classified as types or some type, which I don't have a name for. We might list them out saying that we'll try to address them or try to handle them as a problem and try to federate that in our plan.
I guess I would suggest that any given type can be propagated. Like deployments can just be propagated. Services, ingress, you're just copying configuration. It's like I want to be able to have this other behavior beyond propagation, and that typically will require a controller. So it's not just a matter of scheduling, as you say. It's more like, if I want this advanced behavior, I probably need a controller to implement it. And we're working on a controller that supports, say, scheduling for deployments or programming of DNS for services, like that kind of thing.
Correct. I'm also exactly talking something. It's like in more items as point number 1, what I have listed is the first part. That we can probably list out a proposed mechanism for simple propagation. So these are the sort of steps you have to do if you want to have a type which already does not or is already not as part of whatever we have written so far. you do these set of steps, and you can probably achieve the functionality of simple propagation. But
I just had a thought. You're talking kind of prompted me to think that just in terms of features, rather than talking, like I was kind of, when Quentin started listing off types in the slide, I was like, it was kind of rubbing me. I was kind of like, oh, that doesn't seem right to me. I realized what I think would be sort of easier to communicate is features. So a feature of Federation is I support propagation, simple propagation, like I'm just copying configuration of any type. I support dynamic scheduling of replica sets, dynamic scheduling of deployments. So just listing those as features rather than as APIs, I think would be clearer. And if someone wants that feature, we can document how you would configure it versus how do I support deployments? Well, what do you mean support deployments? Do you mean simple propagation? Do you mean scheduling? Do you mean like something more? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
It does. It does. As point number 2, I exactly listed like that. Something like a feature, which is like scheduling one flavor of scheduling implementation for deployments and replica sets. And same way, we can maybe say a controller or programming a controller for say jobs. Like jobs, as simple jobs, they can be propagated now, but maybe one flavor of scheduling jobs might be which we think later implementing.
I guess my suggestion would be is breaking out, like scheduling for type, and I mean, I'm not saying you have to do it here, but in terms of like laying out all the features that Federation has, rather than saying scheduling for arbitrary types, because there's special cases around, like, say, stateful sets. So it's like scheduling for deployment, scheduling for, because those will be implemented independently, and then we can be like, whenever they're done, we can check them off.
Yeah.
Versus scheduling as a whole, which is it's a problem space, not a problem.
Yeah. So I've been like noodling on slide number 7. Maybe that's useful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
This is. Maybe that's useful.
Yeah, I think that's good.
And then maybe you guys can put some proposed quarter, alpha Q2, beta Q3, GA Q4, or whatever next to each of those.
So I'm just adding in better, like, deploying the API as CRD.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's
maybe we could have a. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you. Carry on.
No, go ahead.
I was going to suggest we have a section of like type specific features, and then these more like infrastructural features, deployment mechanisms, and
like push
plugins for DNS or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, I think the services thing kind of encompasses that. That's probably more of a better user-facing description. For me, just like deployable CRD is user-facing because then they don't have to operationally worry about anything else.
It's just logically different than the types of things that you can manage.
Yeah, like having separate sections. Do we want another slide to separate it that way? It seems like there's a lot of like.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Maybe we just add one here.
So do you want to move? Maybe it makes sense to move. I'm not sure we can put it in.
Yeah, I'm just putting that one on the next slide. Does that make sense?
sure if that's infrastructure or not, but it relates to all types.
That's the wrong one. Yeah, I think that can go there. That's fine.
Anything else? Oh, push reconciliation, right.
Oh, and I guess there's status is another one here that Shashi's been working on. Maybe that fits under. Oh, I don't seem to be able to edit anymore for some. Oh, there we go.
I'm not really sure. I noticed the mention of different status groups. I wasn't really clear on what the differentiation was.
Shashi, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think last time when we tried discussing this, like the status ideally will be consumed by user for a user, or could be for some of our internal controllers. So I think we can have it both. That was the thing suggested by Paul, but we can look back again at that particular thing, like what matters right now. Like if it is for internal controllers, maybe in memory data would be sufficient, I believe. Need not be a API object. But for a user, I think it makes sense for user to get that data. So I think we should represent that in an API object. It depends again from case to case. Like for example, the replica count, that data need not be persisted, but a scheduler can depend on that particular data. Maybe dynamically it can get it by reading from each of the clusters. Similarly, service also can be done like that. And then we can program the DNS controller. So I think it's okay either way. I think, but what status we need to give it to user is the most important thing, I believe.
Yeah, I guess there's a blurry line if we're planning to implement these things as separable controllers, which I think has conceptually been on the diagram up to now. At that point, we do need to communicate between controllers. If the scheduler controller is separate than the propagation controller, for example, then the propagation controller might have to tell the scheduler somehow what the status of the thing in the cluster is. And that seems to motivate for putting it in the API. If you implement a consolidated, a single controller that does both scheduling and propagation, then, sticking it in memory in that thing and having it as sort of non-public data is probably fine.
I guess I'm not entirely sure that there needs to be communication between propagation and scheduling. I would expect a scheduling mechanism to use a shared informer and maintain its own state of the underlying clusters separate from propagation. Unless there's something that, I guess I'm just not sure what propagation could tell the scheduler that the scheduler could schedule itself in the underlying clusters.
Well, the scheduler, sorry, not the scheduler, the propagator can do, well, in practice, if the propagator gets told you need, you know, a replica set with 12 replicas in this cluster, it needs to put that there. And one way of doing that is to say, well, is it there already? If it's not, create it. If it is there already and has like a different set of replicas, then it actually needs to do an update because a create will fail. So it needs to read the state and decide whether to do a create or an update.
Sure, yeah.
And so once it's read the state from the cluster and already knows what the state in the cluster is, which it has to know in order to propagate, do we want something else doing the same reads?
Well, but that's where a shared informer comes in, right? If they're using a shared informer, they're both getting the same stream of updates at relatively low cost.
Is the shared informer, is that
It's a Kubernetes mechanism for sharing connections. And like you basically get a stream of events and anybody can listen to those events. So it's basically a dispatcher. So you could have multiple controllers using a shared informer. They each get the events and they can manage that state however they want independently.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I think that's a good approach. I wasn't aware of that as being something that Kubernetes already did, but yeah, that sounds reasonable.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, just curious, in our federated informer, do we have a normal informers or shared informers? I believe when it was done previously, I think by matching, it was a normal informers, I believe, right?
Yes, they're not shared. They're all in process inside the controller. The controller basically, yeah, has internal mechanisms for communicating with all of the clients.
Okay.
But
No,
not
I'm not-
cross process. Yeah, carry on.
Yeah, I'm not sure that, like, I would say implementing a shared federated informer, I'm not entirely sure there'd be huge benefit. Because, oh, wait, I'm getting things mixed up. A shared federated informer, I think, yeah, you're right. We would actually want that. I keep getting confused as to what it's targeting, and it's targeting the underlying clusters, not the federated API.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that would be something we would have to do for sure.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, in the near term, I don't really think it's a concern because you can implement your controller targeting an informer, and then once we have a shared informer, you're just using a different instantiation of that, but the logic would not be changing at all.
Yeah, agree.
And this actually could be one item in our list of items to do. It seems some effort.
Yeah, it's arguably part of the stuff on slide 8. Yeah, there we go. Cool. I think we're out of time. I got to run, but it seems like we made some good progress. So maybe you guys can put quarters or release dates next to each of those items, at least proposed, and that's sort of our roadmap.
And so quarters are just like calendar quarters. So the next one would be ending in end of June.
Yeah, I think that's our releases happen, or Kubernetes releases happen roughly like that.
Okay.
I think, you know, while we could be decoupled, I think those are the kind of boundaries people are used to and probably make sense as well for us.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, thanks all. See you next week.
Cheers, guys.
See you.
Bye.